My name is Brian Nault, and I'm a professor and program leader in the Department of Entomology at Cornell's AgriTech campus in Geneva, New York. And I have research and extension responsibilities in both insect ecology as well as vegetable entomology. I've been a professor at Cornell for 25 years. I just celebrated my 25th year anniversary 2 days ago, believe it or not. And my program focuses on studying the biology, ecology, and management of insects that attack vegetable crops in general, including those that may transmit pathogens to vegetable crops. And I try to develop ways to manage them and the disease. But I would say over the past 5 to 10 years, my program is definitely concentrated, at least partially, on identify alternatives to neonicotinoid insecticides. And these are insecticides that have been studied a lot in the past decade, mainly because of their negative impacts on non-target insects, especially bees. Basically, this group of insecticides are very commonly used on vegetable crops, and therefore growers have become dependent on them because they are quite effective. So finding alternatives to this group of chemicals is quite challenging. But nonetheless, it's very important because if there are policies or other restrictions on their use, vegetable growers are going to need to have knowledge of how those alternatives behave. In New York State, we have a law called the Birds and Bees Act, and this particular bill is banning neonicotinoid seed treatments on wheat, corn, and soybean. So these are row crops. But within the corn, it does include sweet corn. So there's only one vegetable crop that this bill will impact. So beginning January 1st, 2029, sweet corn growers are not going to be able to use neonics on their seed unless they go through some training, and there's also identification of maybe high risk for seed corn maggot. Despite the fact that maybe only one vegetable crop may be impacted in New York State, there's certainly the potential that there could be future restrictions on their use in New York. Beyond government policy, there are also policies developed by a lot of retail grocery stores that they want pollinator protection plans. And these plans, basically mention that neonics should be limited or not used at all. And depends on the grocery store. So this is another factor why it's really important to identify alternatives.
That's so interesting. I hadn't really thought about that because, of course, there's going to be market forces.
Sure.
Do you have any examples just off the top of your head as far as what the kind of language regarding avoiding the use, not used at all? Like, how are they going to do that? They're just promising?
Right. No, that's an excellent question. And several years ago, the language is a bit more strict by some of these retail stores, as in they won't buy produce that has been treated with neonicotinoid insecticides. Here lately, I've seen the language shift a little bit, maybe soften a touch, where rather than saying maybe not purchasing or not accepting any produce that has neonics on it, but rather growers that use IPM strategies, so integrated pest management strategies, which may not exclude the use of these products, but maybe limit them, and maybe only when necessary.
Something that's determined between the buyer and seller
That's
at that
correct.
point.
Yeah,
Is figuring out the details of what that means. That's
exactly.
very interesting.
Yeah,
Cool.
yeah, yeah.
So, what does this mean for the growers that you work for?
Yeah, that's another good question. As I mentioned earlier, responsibilities in vegetable entomology at Cornell, and that covers all vegetable crops. And I say from A to Z, from asparagus to zucchini. And of course, not all of those vegetable crops are treated with neonics, or nor are they needed. Therefore, I've been concentrating on those particular crops that growers do use neonics on, and focused on them primarily. So that would include the onion, for example, snap beans, sweet corn, potato, and cucurbit crops in particular. There are several other groups, but I think at this point there aren't any alternatives, so growers are going to be limited to them. But I know that you mentioned early on about cabbage maggot, and right now neonics are not used for cabbage maggot management. So that's a good thing. However, I have spent a fair amount of time looking at cabbage maggot management in New York, and the reason being that another product was banned, and that's chlorpyrifos, the trade name Lorsban. That was banned a few years ago across the United States, and it was the primary tool used by cabbage growers to protect the crop against cabbage maggot and other maggot species. So that has been another emphasis in my program, is to identify alternatives to chlorpyrifos.
And those bans were put in place for similar reasons, because that was a product that was known to have a lasting life in the environment outside of the original intention, and also kind of applied prophylactically, which is, depending on who you talk to about what IPM really is kind of anathema to the IPM philosophy.
That's right. It depends on who you talk to. One could argue that it's not if cabbage maggot shows up, it's when. And in that case, treating prophylactically is probably a smart option. But at this
Yep.
point, it's really a pest that attacks early season plantings. It's not something that growers really need to worry about in the plantings in, say, late June and July. The emphasis has been on trying to find alternatives, typically insecticides, because this is a very high value crop, and growers are not likely to just plant the crop and not watch it. And therefore, we've looked at alternatives, mainly not so much seed treatments, but mainly insecticide programs that will protect transplanted cabbage plants. And there's multiple ways that growers will do that. They may treat the trays, seedling trays, with a particular insecticide. They may use insecticide at drench during transplanting, and some will actually spray over the top after the crop has been transplanted in the field. So multiple different ways that growers may or have been using insecticides for cabbage maggot protection.
So to protect those high value crops from having a fly come along and lay her eggs, and then each plant would be dunzo bunzo, right? Like once you have one
Right.
or two eggs laid on that. Is there anything interesting you're finding with your trials?
So yes, to cut to the chase, one of the most effective alternatives we found was to use a diamide as a transplant drench, in particular cyantraniliprole, and the active ingredient. That's the active ingredient. A trade name is Verimark. And it's a bit on the expensive side now, but we expect that the cost will go down after that particular chemical goes off patent. But we found that very, very small quantities of this particular product can be applied to the tray 72 hours before transplanting, and will provide excellent protection of that crop from cabbage maggots. And it's been adopted fairly widespread in New York, but there are still some growers that don't like to use transplanted or transplant tray drenches. So they're still looking for other ways. As I mentioned earlier, using an insecticide in the transplant water, for example. And so our research is focused on not only applying insecticides differently using the modes that I just mentioned, but also using safer products and also biologicals. And this particular season coming up, we're going to be looking at some entomopathogenic fungi, entomopathogenic nematodes, as just some way that maybe we can protect that crop using these beneficial organisms.
Right.
Fingers crossed.
Well, it's all very interesting because it all sounds like no matter what you're doing, you are delivering it right to the plant, right where it needs to be delivered, which reduces spray drift. And I think the product that you're talking about is pretty well known for not having the same risk of escape that the neonics would have, or the chlorpyrifos that you're talking about. Chances are pretty good it's going to stay right there and then degrade in that soil. I'm also kind of interested in the fact that people getting used to having these drenches all of a sudden would be used to doing the right protocols for taking advantage of those entomopathogenic fungi and nematodes, because moisture is so important. Like, do you think that will take a little bit of a shift in how people are thinking about deploying things in a way that would make them more successful in using those bios?
That's exactly what I'm hoping. If there's already experience using a tray drench with a
Yeah.
conventional insecticide, it's not a very big leap to just swap out an entomopathogenic fungus or nematodes. So that's exactly, it'd be great. Or even a combination of the two, you never know. Maybe you can reduce the amount of insecticide in combination with a entomopathogen that's compatible. The other thing that we noticed in our small plot field trials is that sometimes we would find treatments that weren't very effective against controlling cabbage maggot, yet the plants look pretty healthy. So I think that if, with transplanting cabbage and getting them off to a good start, letting those roots get settled in and rapid growth, that the plants are going to be able to take low levels of maggot injury and feeding and not
Yeah.
be compromised in terms of yield. So that's something that we just noticed in our early season trials over the past about 3 years. In terms of what we learned, I mentioned what was successful, but what we also learned was that some growers like to use inexpensive methods for managing these insect pests. Then one way that they like is to use a pyrethroid insecticides over the top of the plant after it's been transplanted in the field. And what we found, even with as many as 4 weekly applications of a pyrethroid insecticide, that we weren't able to get successful management. So sometimes learning things that don't work can be almost as valuable as things that do work. Yeah.
What I was thinking is that nobody likes change. Nobody likes having the rules change on them, but nobody can stop nature from changing. And it sounds like with those pyrethroids, maybe nature is saying those pyrethroids aren't any good. And a lot of this makes me think about some of the downstream impacts of these bans. Being so lucky to be in New York that you have researchers like yourself who are out, like kind of pounding the pavement and figuring out new solutions. Something else that's happening, or I'm curious if you think that this is true, is that because New York will be banning the use of treated seed for sweet corn and field corn, so like the one vegetable of those field crops,
Right.
does that now mean it'll be easier for folks to find the varieties of sweet corn that they would like to grow that's not treated? Because that was always a problem before. Whenever we said, I don't want to buy treated seed, but I like this variety of sweet corn, it's not available. Do you think that the rule changes in New York will make the market change in response to that?
That's a good question. I would hope so, because if there are growers that still would like protection of their crop with a product that's effective against seed corn maggot, there are some. And we identified a number of products that will work, and a couple of them are currently registered. So that's the good news, is that if the growers want to use an insecticide, we have an alternative, and it's a cyanidrolipro-based one called Fortenza. There's another one called Lumivia. So that there's that in place. But what we found in our research in New York, and actually beyond, not just New York, but across the country, that about 70% of our trials, our small plot field trials, we did not get damaging populations of seed corn maggot. And in our studies, we were creating worst case scenarios for seed corn maggot, and yet we still didn't get them. So that tells you a lot right there, that this particular insect, that despite its name, seed corn maggot, may not be as bad of a problem in corn as one might expect.
It's a really interesting group, and like I know that cabbage maggot, onion maggot, seed corn maggot, they're all kind of cousins. And we know that there's, obviously differences in where they choose to lay their eggs. And it sounds like maybe there's differences in their emergence times. Do we have a model that we really like? Are we able to track their flight behavior based on temperature right now?
Yeah, there are degree day models, it's called, that basically includes the impact of temperature on development, of emergence of the adults in the spring, and then the different generation times. And there are models for these pests that you just mentioned, the maggot pests, cabbage maggot, onion maggot, and seed corn maggot. For cabbage maggot, for example, in addition to these degree day models, there are also some other easier indicators for, say, somebody that doesn't want to look up a degree day model on the computer, but you can look at phenology of weeds, like yellow rocket,
Oh,
for example.
okay.
When yellow rocket is blooming, we know that cabbage maggot adults are emerging at that time for that first generation. And then the next generation in the summer oftentimes emerges when daylilies are out. So it's just some nice phenological indicators for when this pest is active.
Okay. So if somebody was going to try to protect those crops using row cover, like using physical barriers, they could have their eyes out for those indicators. That's really
Absolutely.
cool.
Absolutely.
That's much easier than going on to nua.cornell.edu, I
It can be.
guess. Well,
Yeah,
fantastic.
absolutely.
Is there is there anything else I should know about when it comes to talking about any of these pest organisms?
Well, I guess one other point I want to make on some of the research we've been doing on neonic alternatives as seed treatments is that it really depends on the crop. And we noticed that in sweet corn, as I mentioned earlier, that number one, damaging pest populations seem to be a bit less common. And also, there are alternatives that are not neonic based. And so that's a good thing. But then there are other crops like snap bean and dry bean where, yes, we can identify effective products as seed treatments, um, but they may only kill one pest and they may not
Yeah.
be effective against other pests that the neonic seed treatment would effectively control. So as a consequence, uh, replacing a neonic seed treatment in dry bean and snap bean may require not only another seed treatment, but maybe foliar applications of other pesticides. So that could ultimately end up in more pesticide use and
Mhm.
higher costs. To the further extreme with onion, what we found is that neonics tend to be highly effective at managing the complex of maggot species, primarily onion maggot and seed corn maggot. And at this point, uh, identifying alternatives has been extremely difficult. And those that we have identified have not performed very well on their own. So more research is going to be needed to find out if we could potentially combine more than one of the non-neonicotinoid seed treatments to provide a similar level of protection as what a neonic would provide. So basically spans the entire gamut of yes, easy alternatives to no, there aren't any.
It depends.
It depends. Yeah. Well,
Well, it's a I think we covered a lot of good examples of like unintended consequences of changes to how things are, like both good and bad. It's complicated. Do you have any advice for me when it comes to communicating with the public about these tools? I mean, like you've already given me a couple examples of like all these different pressures coming from the market, coming from the state, coming from maybe even your growers asking you about this. Like, what's your advice for me?
well, Anna, I will say that growers don't like change, especially if something works well and
Right.
maybe it's economical. So to move the system, it's can be really challenging. And I think that several factors need to be considered. The cost of the control tactic is important. The method that's used is important in terms of how easy it is to use and how familiar they are to use it, and protecting the environment. Most growers would claim that they are good stewards of the land. So all of those factors are important. And in terms of the order of importance, so that's going to vary most likely from farmer to farmer and maybe from the crop to crop. The higher the value of the crop, the more risk averse that grower is probably going to be because they have a lot more to lose. So I think that moving systems away from, say, the use of a particular product like a neonic can be challenging based on those factors. And that it may be, if the ultimate goal is to maybe not use an insecticide at all, well, the grower is going to have to be very confident that there won't be economic loss. And that may
Yeah.
require maybe moving off a neonic seed treatment, for example, to a non-neonic seed treatment, and then maybe ultimately no seed treatment at all. So it may take there may be a longer process. It's not going to be maybe like a light switch of just, okay, I'm not going to use this anymore.
Yeah.
I'm going to, yeah, go cold turkey, so to speak.
Right. Oh, you raise a good point though that, everybody wants the same thing, right? It's not like farmers love spraying
No,
pesticide. Like they are excellent stewards and their goal is to grow healthy produce for their market. So I
absolutely.
guess that's the best place to start. And then if people keep listening, I can give them all the details that you just told me about how complicated it can get.
Absolutely.
Well, thank
Yeah.
you very much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.